begrüße Sie sehr herzlich zur zweiten Ausgabe dieser Diskursreihe von ZKM und HfG. Diese Diskursreihe hat für diese ersten 2, 3, vielleicht 4 Ausgaben einen Titel. Der Titel heißt Vom Nutzen der Kunst. Und wir haben heute den zweiten Abend. Unsere Gäste sind Wright und Tamarind Rossetti. Herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Constanze Fischbeck. Ich bin Professorin für Szenografie und auch Prorektorin der HfG, also der Partnerinstitution des ZKM. Und wir bestreiten diese Diskursreihe zusammen. Was wäre noch wichtig zu sagen? Wir kreisen in dieser Themenreihe vom Nutzen der Kunst, wollen wir eigentlich den aktuellen Diskurs unserer beiden Institutionen aufgreifen. Aber da, wie Sie ja alle wissen, Alistair Hudson neu angefangen hat am ZKM und mit seinem Antritt das Wort Use, was ja nicht dasselbe ist wie Nutzen, in aller Munde ist. Und passt sozusagen jetzt 2 Leute einzuladen, die sich sehr intensiv mit diesem Wort Usership und Use und Usology oder was es da alles gibt, ausgiebig beschäftigt haben, dachten wir, das ist eine ganz gute Gelegenheit, damit auch Sie, also Sie werden einen Vortrag halten, etwa eine halbe Stunde, alle Fragen loswerden können, die sich vielleicht auch aufgetan haben, was es denn damit jetzt zu tun hat mit dem neuen Use eines Museums und wie lässt sich das überhaupt übersetzen. Auch darüber wird geredet werden. Ich habe schon mal versucht unterzubringen, ob man Use oder Usership nicht nur mit Nutzerschaft, sondern auch mit Gebrauch übersetzen kann. Ich lasse Sie da mal mit alleine, vielleicht lässt sich damit auch rumspielen. Dieser Abend wird in Englisch und Deutsch stattfinden. Der Vortrag selbst wird in Englisch sein. Wir hatten eigentlich geplant, eine AI-Projektionsübersetzung zu machen. Das hat aber in letzter Sekunde technisch leider nicht geklappt. Aber wir sind keine so große Runde hier. Sie können jederzeit die Fragen stellen. Wright kann sie auch auf Deutsch beantworten. Und ja, wir hoffen auf einen schönen Abend, ein schönes Gespräch. Und damit gebe ich gerne weiter an Alistair Hudson. Vielen Dank.
Dankeschön. Willkommen alle zusammen. I switch now to English. I think we will toggle between English and Deutsch tonight. But I just wanted to introduce our guests tonight to the new directors of the Künstlerhaus in Stuttgart, which is a great pleasure to have you in the neighborhood in Baden-Württemberg, over the border in Württemberg. But I've certainly known you both for a long time and known Stephen since I think 2011 when we met at Terminal Convention, which was a conference at a disused airport in Cork in Ireland, which was a curious combination of theoretical conference and plane spotters conference, which I think set up the subsequent relationship. But it was from there, really, I think, that I knew you through working through the Van Abbe Museum and Tanya Bagheera with this question of usership or use. I came from a kind of English Ruskinian background, thinking about when the kind of 19th century proposition of reintroducing use back into art as an idea, and then connecting with obviously your writing, curating, thinking, and so on, very much inputting into the book we made for the Museum of Arte Util, which was the Lexicon of Usership, which is now, I think, 10 years, approaching a 10-year anniversary of that now.
It is 10 years old, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not going to go too much into your bios because I think we can all Google these days, and I think what's great is if you can kind of really just now kind of expand on this idea of usership. I think you're do a presentation of some sort for 40 minutes, maybe, so 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a discussion, and hopefully do that discussion in toggling between German and English. So I'll hand over to you. And I think we might go and sit in the front row so we can actually see the slides properly as well.
That's perfect. Great. Thank you. I need to turn this on probably.
Or maybe you talk really fast.
If I talk like that, yes, it works. Well, thank you for this introduction, and thanks for this invitation. It's wonderful to be here. We are here as not only fellow travelers, but as fellow neighbors. We applied for a job in Stuttgart, which was the artistic direction of the Künstlerhaus Stuttgart, but we claimed to apply to be the usership coordinators. They weren't looking for usership coordinators, but they ended up with them. And so what we want to do in the next sort of in a relay of microphones, in the next half hour is talk, is really to do two things. To talk about this concept, this useological concept of usership, and unpack some of the conceptual vocabulary that comes with it, and that might replace another conceptual vocabulary which is much more widely in use now in the art world, in the mainstream art world, and to talk about what it would be like if we made way for usership within institutions, and in particular at art institutions. So what it would be like if in a place like Künstlerhaus Stuttgart or ZKM or elsewhere, there was a veritable atmosphere of usership. So I think I need to start by saying a few words about this word. So if you look in the Oxford Dictionary, for example, you will not find usership. And yet the word is out there. People are applying it. It stands opposed, I would say, to three. Use and usership stands opposed to three very stalwart conceptual institutions in our world, in our societies. On the one hand, in the world of aesthetics, in the world of art, it stands opposed to spectatorship. Users are not spectators. Usership is not a form of particularly robust looking or spectatorship. It is something else, and I'm going to try to say what exactly it is. And the second point is that it stands opposed to expert culture. The kind of expert culture which is absolutely rampant within in the art world, but not only. The contention would be that users, just by virtue of using something, have a kind of inherent knowledge about that tool, about that service, that the expert, from a distance perspective, would not have. And that's very paradoxical, because in a kind of in a kind of epistemocracy that we live in, where power is based on knowledge and expert knowledge, users are kind of relegated to a secondary epistemic condition. And to talk about usership in the way that we talk about it is, in a sense, to try and talk about a cognitive privilege that comes through use. And the third point that usership stands opposed to is ownership. So there's a kind of a political economic dimension to usership. Users are not owners in waiting. Users are those that collective subjectivity that makes use of something. A couple of weeks ago, I want to now say something something kind of specific and kind of general, so that you understand where I'm coming from when I use this unusual word. I saw in the New York Times a headline a few weeks back that said that West Africans were changing the French language one rap and one joke at a time. And the gist of the article was incredibly interesting, was that the colonial masters had imposed the French language, of course, on their African colonies, the way the English had also done with theirs. The Africans didn't want that language, they didn't ask for it, and they don't own it, but they make use of it. And in fact, because they are more numerous now, I mean, French speakers in the southern hemisphere are more numerous than those in the northern hemisphere. It is in fact in their hands that that language is now being formed and deformed, misformed perhaps, in any case transformed, by this community of language users. And certainly there are, we use tools, and when we use tools, we say that we make use of tools. We use drugs, we make use of drugs. But ultimately, I think it is the best example to understand why I feel that that usership names a very powerful category of subjectivity, of aesthetic, artistic, and political subjectivity, is that the users of a language determine its meaning. There is no meaning outside of the community of use. In other words, as users of language, we have a tremendous degree of responsibility because the meaning, all the meaning that there is, depends on the use which we make. Though that's a great deal of responsibility, but no individual user has very much power to change things. Even the most innovative and powerful user of a language individually has not so much power to do anything with it, because if you venture too far in an audacious use, then you go outside of the bounds of comprehensibility, and the use does not gain traction. Okay, so when we talk about usership, I tend to think of it as in terms of using a language, a symbolic language, a language of art, a language of signs, symbolic languages, and natural languages. But it is that idea that meaning is in the hands of the usership that gives it such incredible clout and makes it, if you like, comparable to that category of political subjectivity of the 20th century, which was the proletariat. That political class which from its worm's eye perspective had the capacity, it was felt, to transform that society through collective revolutionary action. That didn't work out. But that kind of power we might see now shifted to that category of political subjectivity, which is usership, and which is in every other way different than the proletariat, except that, because of course users are driven by self-interest and not by collective interest, not through solidarity, but through ruse and so on. But they do have the proletariat and usership have one key thing in common, and this is very important to bear in mind in a place like ZKM, is that usership today names the principal site of surplus value extraction. Because users, just as the proletariat did 100 years ago, usership is what produces information, produces value, produces knowledge. And that knowledge, or that value, when it is extracted, rarely accrues back to those users who produced it. It doesn't, because it's still believed, and this is, I think, an illusion which is slowly correcting itself, is that usership is not production, it's consumption. And what I want to suggest, and the reason I use this term of usership, is that usership it's both. It's both production and it's consumption, and it's neither one, it's something else altogether.
All right. Here we go. Now we have how we're going to use our new ideas and some of the ideas that we've actually been working with for a long time on our farm. So some of you have been aware through what we wrote up on the website that we actually spent a few years running an organic permacultural farm. And we decided to run the farm as an art project. And during that time, we explored all of the different ways which we could learn new skills and new techniques and new ways to grow our own food and then to share that, and also exploring ways to sell it and to make food. So we are coming now with all that we learned in that time to take those skills and that permacultural perspective and apply that to what we're doing now as a cultural activity.
Usership is a inherently collective a notion, but it names two different axes. The word usership names the full set of uses that can be made of any, let's say, any territory or any institution, any toolbox of any kind. So anything that you could do here in the ZKM would be part of its usership. You have the tools, the resources, the misuses, and so on. That would be its usership in a kind of an objective sense. All the machines that you could make use of. But those who make use are also the usership. It's the other sense. It's the vertical axis. And when we talk about usership, of course, it's broader than merely human subjectivity, which is already fairly broad. But we might say that there are other than human users of the ZKM. I haven't investigated, but I'm sure there's some moss growing along some of the tops of some of the windows. Well, it may seem trivializing to point that out, but that moss is also making use of a support structure. And I think one of the key things that we took away from our farming experience and that we want to bring to our usership coordination at Künstlerhaus is the idea that artistic agency, and also, by extension, maybe political agency, is not the exclusive purview of human agents. Although we've been trained and taught to think that art is a human undertaking for all sorts of reasons because only humans can intend such things, and so on. But when we observed closely the functioning of our farm, when we looked at the interaction between the interspecies or interspecific relationships, we saw that actually usership was a much broader term that fitted to all those agents which made some kind of use of a space, of a territory, and of a time.
So we came up with the idea related to One Health as an example for one usership. So instead of there being multiple userships in either a farm or in an institution, the way to look at how we're thinking about it is that there are multiples and they all make up one. So instead of there being the health of one person or the health of one type of a person or one age of a person, there is the idea that we are all experiencing or working towards one health. So that could also include the environment, that could include the space that we're in, it could include the interaction of multiples, and we're thinking of one usership exactly in that way. So we're working with one usership at the Künstlerhaus and also thinking about that in a broader sense of, like Stephen just said, the interspecies and the other energy that we're interacting with, which could even be the the weather or the experiences that we are part of.
I don't know if you've all been to the Künstlerhaus Stuttgart, and we certainly hope to see you there as we get our programming up to speed. But its singularity is that it's a small museum-like institution. It has large spaces which were previously or often used for exhibitions. But it also has studios and studio holders, and it has a series of workshops. About a dozen workshops: photography, lithography, new media, sound, and so on, letterpress. And what we've noticed is that the userships of these different spaces and these different programs, we felt they could be better integrated. And of course, usership is actually a highly diversified, differentiated category. So it's not about creating some kind of homogeneity, but of thinking of all those agents who make use, and so that, such that whatever goes on in our spaces should run through the workshops, and whatever goes on in the workshops should run through the spaces. And so for that reason, we've developed a term which is up on here, is that creating a kind of an atmosphere of usership. Oh, this is my word. So what does user-oriented or usership-generated art look like? Well, it doesn't look like anything in particular other than what it is. And it often doesn't look like art. One of the principal characteristics of usership oriented or determined art practices is that they operate on the one-to-one scale. They are what they are, and propositions of what they are, artistic propositions. And this stands in counter-distinction to the dominant paradigm of modernist art, which, however monumental, and we know that it was at times very monumental, always operated in some way on a reduced scale. It was something other than what it was. At best, it was some kind of prototype. But what we've noticed over the last several decades, during what some people refer to as the usological turn in society and in aesthetic production, is a ramping up of the scale of production. Not so much a crisis of representation, but a crisis of scale has set in and has led many practitioners to scale up their production to the one-to-one scale, even though the work itself may be very modest and very humble. So what happens then when you ramp up your production to the one-to-one scale? And again, we're not talking about size. We're talking about artists who move out of the mainstream art world based on spectatorship, authorship, and objecthood, and certainly on eventhood, move out to find other art-sustaining environments. Looking to shake off the trappings of autonomy that, rather than allowing art to develop freely and more audaciously, actually hold it back from having any kind of traction in the real. So they venture outside of the conventional times and spaces of art towards other territories. And there's been a lot of writing about that, a lot of documentation, archiving of these types of practices, which are very, very widespread now, where artists go out and work in communities with other agents or actors from other walks, avenues of social life, both in the marketplace and in the social spaces and political spaces, medical spaces, scientific spaces, you name it. There's been a lot of attention to what goes on when these collaborations outside the spaces and times of art take place. And the difficulties, the challenges that that brings because of the disparities in power between artists and those who they're often working with. So that's been well analyzed and will continue to be. But what's been less analyzed is what happens to those spaces that they left when they went out. You know, we say that nature abhors a void, and so does culture. And when they create this void, what happens? Well, this is something which we're trying to embed into our atmosphere of usership, and which we describe through this unnecessarily polysyllabic term, which is extraterritorial reciprocity. In other words, that the space that's been vacated in art institutions by these forays into life worlds can be usefully invested, can be usefully used by practitioners from other avenues of creative life, perhaps even those with whom the artists are working as they have left the art spaces. In other words, creating a kind of reciprocity between and breaking down a binary between inside and outside of institutions. A kind of breathing, if you like, between the lungs, which was the art institution that has been vacated, and that atmosphere outside, bringing the inside in and pushing the inside out. Another word that is interesting to bear in mind is a term we take from Marcel Duchamp, of all people, the notion of the coefficient of art. Of course, Marcel Duchamp was, if not the only artist of the 20th century, certainly the one who set the agenda for everything that was to happen in the coming century. Basically, through, although it's not always described in this way, the incredibly strong ontologization of art. In other words, Duchamp, and followed later by countless others, John Cage, Manzoni, Warhol, and so on, is that nothing distinguished the art object, the artistic proposition, from the mere real thing. The difference was merely ontological. You couldn't perceive, no matter how closely you looked, you couldn't see any difference between art and the real thing. So this was this very strong ontologization, which left us with the question, is this art or not? But for these practices which we're talking about, which are usership generated, usership oriented, this idea of is it art, yes or no, this idea that art has an ontology and indeed it doesn't have anything else, is very inadequate. And it's funny because Duchamp himself, who put us in this, this difficult situation, painted us into this corner, in a short text came out with this idea of a coefficient of art. Now, he used it in a very different way than I'm using it here, and we could go into that. But when I hear the notion coefficient of art, I hear not an ontological question, is this art or not, but rather, how much art have we here? What degree of art is this? Not is it, yes or no, but to what extent and to what degree? What is its coefficient of art? Well, obviously something which is showcased in a certain context, in a certain frame, is, at least for a certain community of people, has a high coefficient of art. But the same thing, put out into a community, could actually have a negligible coefficient of art. And we have discovered that in trying to create an integrated usership, in creating an ecosystem based on usership, that this notion of whether it's art or not is not useful, and the question of to what extent is it art, its coefficient of art, to be much more useful.
Okay, so as we've been talking about ideas that we want to continue with in our project, things that work, and also things that no longer serve our ideas or our hopes or our vision for what we want to create moving forward, personally and in community, and also in larger groups, institutions, and what we're putting forth to share with our fellow travelers, as Alistair would say. An idea that we've been working with is hospicing out. And that comes also from the hospice work related to people when they are treated with care, with love, and with consideration until the last breath. Now, you may be familiar with the idea of hospice work for people who are either terminally ill or possibly terminally ill. They may still recover, but the idea is that everyone has the best quality of life, and it's not everyone the person, it's everyone in connection with the person. And so it's a relationship of hospice. It's not about the one, it's about the collective, and it's about having dignity and breath, as we were just talking about, to the very last. And so when we're talking about our work with art and our work with institutions, we're thinking about how can we hospice out? How can we have that same type of care, that same consideration for things that no longer work? But we want to begin something new or something different. It might even be taking some of the things that have worked and letting go that which no longer helps us to share and to amplify and to intensify what we do value at this moment, what we value in art and what we value in creativity, whether it actually has a high coefficient or a low coefficient of art, that it is what we want to focus on right now. It is what we want to share. And how can we let go of, with grace and dignity, what no longer works? So that's another word, the hospicing out.
Well, here's one that needs to be hospiced out. Spectatorship. Which is why you see there's a little bit of a red triangle here. Spectatorship needs to be hospiced out of the field. Well, what we're proposing here, we want to make it clear, and I think that's the essence of hospicing out, is that this is not some kind of avant-garde project. It's not about tabula rasa. It's not about the great tomorrow. It's not revolutionary. There is nothing about usership which is revolutionary. It's based on a form of radical pragmatism. Users know that no matter how well things go, that it's never going to be theirs. Usership is a perspective of those who are always playing away games. They're always playing on somebody else's turf. So it's very much about transformation through use, but not about revolution. But spectatorship was that notion which was put forth about 250 years ago. Well, it was triumphed as a conceptual institution in 250 years ago in the work of Immanuel Kant, who put forward two very important ideas to rule out basically the idea that art could be useful, could have a use, which he felt would lead either to propaganda or to design, but not to art, which had to be premised, he felt, on its purposeless purpose. It's zwecklose Zweck. It's purposeless purpose on the one hand, and this purposeless purpose was oriented towards a category not of users, but of disinterested spectators. And in a certain respect, spectatorship is not simply one of the most deeply set conceptual institutions in the conceptual architecture and the physical architecture of art spaces. that we've inherited from modernity. But it is that to such an extent that it appears to be self-evident. And what spectatorship actually has effectively done, and Kant was extremely effective in this, is that by foregrounding to that, with that power, spectatorship, there was something that was repressed. And it could be argued that that repression was of usership and of use. So in a certain way, what really needs to be hospiced out, in addition to spectatorship, is the project of modernity itself. Maybe we'll move along a little bit more quickly here, but the notion of autonomy is also one of the watchwords of the modernist project within art. And it was always felt that autonomy was one of the most important and remains one of the most cherished conceptual institutions amongst our institutional experts. And one can easily see why, right? Is that autonomy is what allows art to develop freely without being preyed upon by theological or political censorship. But at the same time, that conceptual gain comes at an incredible cost. A cost which many now feel is too high. The cost being that, yeah, but it's just art. It's art, but it's just art. 50 years ago, that expression wouldn't have made no sense. It's just art. Because art, in its modernist heyday, did not shy away from its ontology. It lived with pride, its ontology as art. But through a series of, one might say, rather perverse dialectical movements, that autonomy has now become a tripping stone for art, a trap. But this is another big one, eventhood. Usership, in a way, is characterized by its imperformativity. If you try to perform usership, you don't get usership. The entire art world structure, which we've inherited from the 20th century, is based on an ideology of eventhood. Everything is about events. Publications, vernissages, exhibitions, you name it. It's oriented towards this, and yet that represses the dark matter that makes up art 95% of the time, which is going on in the background, which is the preparation, which is everything that constitutes that atmosphere of use and of usership. Everything about making use is somehow subordinated to this notion of the event. And that's something which I think is a very masculinist and very modernist understanding of the workings of art, and something that needs to be rethought if we want to seriously make way for usership and to create this different atmosphere we're talking about.
So in considering what we're going to do instead, still working with art, working with institutions, working with creativity, working with people who make things and want to share things, and us also as people who do that and who want to see. There's so many great things that actually exhibits and artists make, and what is working and what is not working in terms of how we want to move forward. So what we've come up with and what seems to make sense at this moment is the idea of the process and of breathing and of the atmosphere that we actually are a part of all the time. How can we bring that idea into the institution to be able to still share and to be able to amplify and to be able to intensify? Those were the three words that we identified in terms of what works in exhibition or what works in the event of an exhibition. There is something really, really beautiful and intense when people get together and put this attention and energy and creativity into sharing in either a space or in a public space or in a gallery. So we want to actually share the process of the building up, kind of like we experienced when we were doing our planting, learning about what goes into it and how can we show that and share that, not only doing that behind the scenes and then having the event of showing the finished product and then having another event over and then all of the rest of it hidden once again. So we're thinking of including the whole, maybe not the whole part of it, part of the intensifying, growing, increasing part. And then we also will allow the work to be in the space and other works to grow and add and decrease as we're continuing building and participating in this atmosphere.
Well, that's something we take absolutely from our farming experiences. There are no events in agriculture. I mean, there's a celebration when the harvest is finished. But you don't get a harvest in a day, and things move at a certain rate. And so taking that model into an institution and imagining what would a kind of a perma-artistic practice look like? What would a kind of a institutional permaculture actually look like? Well, maybe it would be, amongst other things, based on an atmosphere that using an atmosphere as in a counter-distinction to an exhibition, that was based on succession planting, which means that everything would not be ripe the same day, nor would everything be sown in the same day. So an exhibition or an atmosphere would not be a stable entity the way an exhibition is supposed to be, but something which morphs over time.
And there is still the component of sharing, which of course is very important when you have a space in which people come together like we are here this evening, and also a space in terms of a gallery or a space as a museum. And we want to be able to continue that and to work with the sharing component that is not available when you are in your own space, in your private space, or as we also were on the farm. We felt that that was an amazing experience and we learned a lot from it. And yet there are these group situations, these sharing moments that we have in institutions, especially cultural institutions, that we want to continue and participate in.
I want to say a couple of words about this notion of externalities, because it's often not a term which is associated with art-related activity. Externalities can be negative or positive, but they are the byproducts of usership. So by using certain chemicals in a certain process, for example, the negative externality might be an incredible act of pollution of a water system or something like that. But usership also inherently produces positive externalities. It produces a kind of cognitive surplus, a value surplus. And just by the virtue of use, I mean, this is, in a sense, what the whole world of artificial intelligence is really premised on, is that there is a kind of surplus or a positive externality which is developed. And we want to, rather than thinking of art as something which is value neutral in that respect, this function of which is to produce a kind of aesthetic delectation, but in this case is to generate positive externalities.
So with the idea of atmosphere, we're also continuing thinking about a life-sustaining environment as an organic or permaculture farm, is that all of the components are there and working together with the aim of sustaining life, creating an environment in which all parts are sustaining the family, the animals, and the community that's around. So we're taking that idea and thinking what makes up an art-sustaining environment in a cultural institution.
So the question then is, so how do you institute usership? How do you actually give it some kind of traction within a horizon of expectations? Certainly you want to challenge those expectations, but we've identified three dimensions that, at least for our purposes at the Künstlerhaus Stuttgart, which we want to bear in mind in this attempt to embed the paradigm, a useological paradigm in our small institution. One, the necessity for art historical referencing. And this, to ground things which are actually often done on the one-to-one scale outside of the performative frame of the art world, oftentimes in collaboration with a majority of non-artists who attribute a very low coefficient of art to whatever is being done, is to ground it in strong art historical references, to give it a kind of, not to give it a feeling of legitimacy, because in a way it would be more exciting to venture away from that, but to see, let's say, farming practice, permaculture farming practice, as an extension of a tradition of landscape painting. And so to take, for example, a canonic work by someone like Van Gogh and unpack it in an exhibition or in an atmosphere more related to contemporary permaculture today, to have a strong proposition in artistic programming. Well, this is very specific perhaps to our context, where there was to too great an extent for us, for our purposes, a kind of rift between what went on in the workshops, which were accessed by a broad community of users, and what went on in the post-conceptual exhibition spaces. And yet, we can't simply ignore a horizon of expectations around artistic programming. And so what's interesting is to come with very powerful contemporary propositions that will enrich the conversation between those different categories of users in order to develop this idea of one usership. And three, the proposition to be connected to workshop usership. Well, this is, in our case, we have these fabulous workshops, these fabulous machines that are being used, but that usership suffers from a kind of epistemological chauvinism, I would have to say, or has historically, and perhaps increasingly, even a kind of ontological chauvinism, I would say. In other words, but that's more craft. It's upstairs that we have the art. Well, we need to break that down. But to break that down, you need to use ruse. And of course, you know that the word ruse is an anagram of user.
So we're continuing to think about the seasons as well in terms of farming and the cycles of actually, we're in the winter right now, and thinking about the coming of the spring, the big, as we just talked about, could be more event focused, but like a big show a big presentation, but where things are really growing and things are really happening and you can really see what's growing, as opposed to in the winter when it's underground and when the ideas are forming and when the seeds are just getting going. And we're thinking about that in terms of what we have already spoken, perma-artistic practice. How is it that we can continue looking at the seasons and the cycles of individual artists and their work, and also the overall programming? So we're thinking about in creating the rhythm of atmospheres in cycles that is in relation to, in unison with, the cycles of the seasons.
By perma-artistic practice, we mean finding art-sustaining environments which do not depend on the artificial life systems of the mainstream art world. It means that in our admittedly perilous times, where the future is quite uncertain, we feel it's imperative that art, with joy, but with determination, find ways to invent an ecosystem and to exist within that ecosystem, to co-build an ecosystem that will be more robust and that does not depend on the artificial oxygen systems of our institutions.
This is the concentric circles of the permaculture idea, and we're applying that as well, where the first circle is the house, the second circle out is the kitchen garden, the third circle is the fruit trees, and the fourth is the field becomes the wood. And we can think of that also in terms of work and in terms of energy. The idea is to do the least work or the least unnecessary amount of expending energy when you're growing your garden. And so what do you need to give the most attention to and the most detail and the most watering and the most weeding is right outside your door. So you really put all of the things that need a lot of attention right outside, and that's the kitchen garden. And then the things that are actually going pretty strong, the fruit trees, they don't need as much attention. They don't need as much watering. They don't need as much daily care. So that's a little bit further afield. And then all the way out where the field becomes the wood is actually going to be an area where there's something that you might not even know that it's a garden, and you might not know that it's part of your garden, or it's becoming the wood, and the wood is also becoming your home area. And so we're taking this idea and seeing how can we apply that to the Künstler Haus, which is the artist's house, and where do we need to put the most attention? And we're starting this year with the home, with the house, and what can we work on within the Künstler Haus? And as we expend more energy to getting to know our own environment and our own most close relations, then the following year, the idea is to go a little further afield, to extend and to grow and to make connections a little bit further out, and to continue that over the years as we create our community and participate in the communities that are already here.
Yeah, so we ran a farm as an art project. I mean, it was a real working farm. It was on the one-to-one scale. We produced vegetables. We sold them at a farm stand, which we had, and we transformed them in farm-to-table dinners. But we felt actually that it would be interesting to try the inverse and to take an art project, something which was clearly had a high coefficient of art, and run it as a farm project, and to do so over time, because what we learned, the other point of permaculture is that it's not only spatially based, but it's time based. That each year focuses on moving out. One row further in terms of engagement with the surrounding territories. And I think that the last slide, right after these, is what we are planning, an example of one of the workshops which we want to add to the list of existent workshops, which is, to put it quickly, a art research workshop. Because our hypothesis was that art research actually is one of the most interesting and useful tools which exists now within contemporary art, but it's largely reserved for an elite which already has a master's degree, an MFA. Whereas you see photography in the darkroom, or a sound, or lithography, or etching, you don't need any master's degree for that. That's just for the people in the neighborhood to use the workshops. Well, what we want actually is to through this idea of one usership, is to extend, and I don't think it's been done before, the idea of a highly performing, highly cutting-edge art research workshop that would run rather like a PhD art research program, but for everybody. And so that would be that's something which is one of our priorities in terms of these activating the energies of the workshop in the broader programming. It's something which we plan to get going as soon as possible, but probably it will take a year or two. Our watchword is this: agriculture is the future of art.
Sure. Thank you both. That was very, all-encompassing, I think. I wanted to, I think we can open up to questions pretty soon, but we can get things going a little bit as well. Because obviously, in comparison, we have similar idea sets in many ways, but obviously here at ZKM, we're dealing with technology, which also has a usership. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on how you see that the term usership coming really through a technological culture as well. I mean, often it's more widely used in digital culture, and how you saw that fitting with your rather agrarian worldview.
Yeah, I think we both would have a lot to say about that. Actually, we had a slide called technology, which we took out. Perhaps because we felt a little intimidated by the circumstances or the environment here. I think that without the kind of technological revolution brought about through social media, that the useological turn would not have occurred. I think that, usership's been with us since time immemorial, but as I said in passing, it's become, in our highly connected societies, it's become the key site for surplus value extraction, because it's the key site of value production, and for information production, content generation, and so on. So, but what we're trying to do is to expand that idea of usership outside the world of technology, where actually it's probably one of the most de-dramatized or decomplexed settings where the term is used, where usership is not at all taboo. It's not like the art world, which is supposed to be removed from that, but which is actually quite at home with the notion of users and so on. But to actually, the advantage I see of, and what it's a political advantage as well as a just an epistemic one, is that usership is this very broad category which encompasses all of us as those who are in charge of meaning through language and through technical, in technical language as well. Because the owners can try and shut the users out, but they don't like to do that because to shut them out would be to fall into a performative contradiction because you would be shutting out the very source that's most interesting to you, the source of knowledge and value and information production. So users have no power in a way, but an incredible power in another way. And I think it's clearly visible in the world of technology, but we tried to drag it and drop it in the world in a more agrarian environment to see how it works there and to see actually that as it's not just as users that I think when we went into farming, when we first went into the greenhouse and really gung-ho, let's go here, we thought that we were the users of this technology and of this space, of these resources. And then we came to realize, in fact, that there was a kind of shared usership. We were using it, we had chickens, but there was also foxes. And rather than describing the foxes as pure predators, to see them also as common users of a bigger picture. And I think when you're able to do that, a garden is also a very interesting place, I think, or at least we felt, to unpack that useological paradigm, just the same way that technology would be. But the beauty, in a way, is that the same conceptual vocabulary and the same conceptualizations work equally well in one and in the other.
I was looking at technology specifically because we're planning on coming here, but also because we've been listening to various different authors speak about the technology of the novel or the technology of, and I was thinking out specifically when we were getting our slideshow together about the atmospheres and the exhibitions, like what is a technology of an exhibition? It's a know-how that's repeated. And what is the difference between a know-how that's repeated or a skill that's repeated and what is called high-tech, which is usually, I would think, what would be associated with the ZKM, was high technology. Why is that? I'm sure you've thought about it a lot, but I was thinking about it on the way here. And it's really not, it's not separate. The way that we're looking at the farm experience is that we gained some technology. We gained some know-how and we repeated it. And we used what others have done in the past to learn ourselves basically how to live well. So the idea or the experiment was, how can we live well? How can we grow our own food? How can we be in this one health with the environment, with the animals, and with the food that we grow, and then the food that we share? And so in terms of how does it work with high-tech space, I think it works quite well because it actually has to do with the skills that we're using and the people that we're calling users and also the non-humans that we're calling users at this moment or that we're becoming aware of, that we're all in this together, so to speak. Does that answer your question? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Constanze, you want to?
Ich glaube, ich spreche jetzt mal Deutsch, ich wäre jetzt erstmal neugierig, ob es schon Fragen aus dem Publikum gibt. Ah, doch, viele, dann sollten wir doch da. Mit dem darf ich. Wie schneller Texte.
Thank you for it.
Das müssen Sie anmachen.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was funny for me because I've got an engineering degree in Kulturtechnik and I don't want to speak about all the parallels between this engineering skill of crop cultivation, but that's in German, it's very strong link between culture and culture. I've got another question referring to your coefficient. Coefficient is always a ratio. and a dimensionless ratio. And I'm interested in the dimensions you are choosing and what you declare as the 100% art.
Well, admittedly, I didn't think of it in terms of percentage. I didn't set a top limit on the coefficient. I felt that it could be very high, or it could be negligible, and it can slide, and it can change depending. Well, depending on context and depending on usership. And there also are strategies, of course, for deliberately impairing the coefficient. And other strategies, well-known ones, for deliberately boosting that coefficient.
Yeah, but it can boost only between 0 and 1.
Well, let's say that 1 is...
Then art is art.
Yeah.
Then it's 1. And
yes,
if it's far away from art, it's close to 0.
Yes, exactly.
So that's the dimension
Well,
we are talking
it's
about
one-
if
it's
you
one.
use the term coefficient.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Duchamp had such a clear mathematical understanding of the term he was proposing, but it's
Oh,
true.
yes, he had. And I think he was aware of that.
Potentially.
That's my
Yeah.
assumption.
In any case, there are cases where the ontology of art is so unquestionable that then we would put it at 1. But there are other cases when everybody misses it, and so it would in that case be 0.
Yeah, but the question still is, what's the art definition of art, which is the scale for your coefficient?
So what you're saying is that, in fact, we do not avoid the idea of art having an ontology through the coefficient of art.
No, we don't. We just put it in the center of our interest.
Well, the interesting thing is that's very logical, but the term art itself, its meaning is not fixed in stone. It's not fixed in logic. It's also subject to, let's say, user adjustment historically. The term which the Greeks used, which interestingly was techne, covers a whole different set of symbolic configurations and activities than the word art. Art, when it emerged, did not designate for initially at all what we understand by this term. It was a way of doing things, a better way of doing things, a way of doing things with art, if you like. And so in some ways, I think that one of the consequences of talking about a coefficient of art rather than saying, yes, this is or this isn't, is that it becomes more useful to talk about a kind of to use words like an adverb, rather than thinking of art as a noun, to think of it as a kind of adverb that is able to modify a verb, to inflect an action, but not actually be one itself. So things are done artfully or artlessly is perhaps closer to this way I see the consequences of this usological turn, which I'm trying to think about and think about how to accommodate in an institution, if you get it.
Also,
Okay,
is it
I
fair to
stop here.
Sorry, but I was going to add: is it perhaps actually impossible for something to reach 100% art? Because then it would, in effect, disappear. It would be because something has a attraction with the world, and therefore there's an element of it which is not art in order to integrate it into the world. And I always imagined this idea of the coefficient less as a linear line, but almost like a three-dimensional space, or even a multi-dimensional space in which there are all fields of possibilities are contained within that. And in a way, art becomes almost like a little vector in that space, connecting points. And those points are dependent on all the kind of factors and contingencies that make up its, whatever we're considering, whatever its state of being is. And they're all connected through time and space, like all of us are. And in a way, the kind of the artfulness comes through that navigation, comes through that trajectory that is created.
Yeah, I had the idea that probably everything you see or you meet is going to be by transformation into art, because the products or things or ideas, always it happens, there's a change to be into a brilliant something else. And we have this in literature, and sometimes it is like the basis for new ideas in development, because I am thinking of science fiction. We have ideas which are very useful, very helpful for new events and in digital and all kinds of technical ways. So I think so too. If you are talking about agriculture or other ways of living, everything, also handicraft, can turn to brilliant ideas and to brilliant new products and all kind of ways. So I think it's very bright to see what could happen, what it is, what it could be for us in our life. In all ways you see and you meet. And so I think the idea agriculture is the future of art. I think I would agree. And if you take all the way of life, what you see, which we meet, and the transformation of ideas, or we had in dance or in painting, and people see something, they meet it, and it happens in their brain. And first, it happens always in the brain. We have a new world of ideas which is going to be enrich all the people, or probably, or not all, I don't know. But anyway, I think it will help the people to be human. And this is a very important way which culture and art has to do and to realize in the brain and in the emotion of the people. I think this is very, very important. Thank you.
I would just say in response to that, of course, not everything is art and not everything should be art, although everything has potentially a coefficient of art. But agriculture and art have a different and closer relationship. Painting, for instance, is a kind of transformation, is using light to produce a kind of a transformation. And in that way, it's very much akin to gardening or farming. And by extension, the transformation of a landscape, which is done by human agents, but not only, all forms of usership transform landscapes and are therefore, in some ways, the co-authors of that landscape, means that for us, or at least the way we're thinking of usership, means that since usership is in a way the future of art, that embodied usership is kind of very much akin to agriculture. Which is why we're so inspired by an artist who once showed here at the ZKM several, or I guess maybe even several decades ago, Gianfranco Baruchello, who, as a conceptual artist, who worked for many years with Marcel Duchamp, he initiated in the area west of Rome a full-on one-to-one scale art project, farm, as an art project, and ran Agricola Cornelia for many years, both as a farm and as a proposition of a farm.
Hi. Thank you so much. I love the approach. I think it's very recent, and I saw examples where, from the fashion industry actually, where this is applying literal things like where we talk about like growing textiles or the fabrics and how we can bring them back into the cycle, into the soil, and have a complete cycle in the end. But I would love to, because for me it was a little bit abstract, how this is now applying to the artwork itself or the artist, or are we talking about the environment artists are in? So could you give us an example of how that affects, like that approach and that idea of agriculture is affecting actually the work?
Yeah. I think, like you said, in a lot of industries right now, there's actually a huge turn to look towards the plants in architecture as well as fabric or fashion design. And in a number of fields right now, there is this awareness and this acceptance and this welcoming of even an embrace of the knowledge, of the consciousness, of the possibly the knowledge that maybe we have pushed away or that we have lost, that we're now ready to reintegrate or that we're ready to learn from. And so it is a bit abstract in terms of thinking of it in terms of an institutional implementation, because the materials themselves, like the mushrooms or the seeds or the items that we can use to make artwork or to make clothing or to make building materials, are tangible. So what our project is to take that and apply that to an abstract context of organization. And so the idea is that, yes, it will apply to the environment in which we are in and the ways in which we are working together. And I think, unless you have something else to share, that it is a process that we are embarking upon right now. And so the actual examples are still to come. So we're working with these ideas to create the framework for us to enter into this institutional relationship, into this configuration. And we want to use the tangible experiences and skills and practices that we've learned in an abstract form and see how we can do that. So what we've presented today is an exploration of the ideas that are guiding us to do that. And we will see how we can live them, how we can do them.
So what will happen with ownership then, for example? If we are talking about, we have the artwork that is usually going its ways, right? And like it can be sold, it can be owned, it can be placed somewhere, it can be lended or borrowed or whatever. So what does that mean when we, in terms of like usage, and like, does that mean that we as a community create a space where art is in, and then we all have something from it and to it, and we have a relationship to it? We build that, and it's not private anymore? Or I have so many questions.
I think what we are at right now is the time for questions, because what we would like is to continue this conversation. I personally don't have the answer for ownership of art, because that is something that we are entering into right now at this moment in history. If that is something that we're ready to, or even have a desire to, as artists or as institutions? Is there an interest in letting that concept go or not? It isn't necessarily going to be something across the board. I think that's what we were talking about with the hospicing out slide, and that concept is we're in a moment, at least we are in a moment, and we are in this conversation talking about what no longer is serving our move forward, what no longer is this perma-artistic practice that we want to continue. So I would say personally, ownership is a lot of, there's still a lot of use that is made out of ownership, and there's a lot of, I mean, in psychology, people talk about it with the ego. It actually is quite useful to have a separate entity as a human being, because we need that to survive in some ways, but it can get out of control. It can get too much. And so where are we going to keep that? With the ownership of artwork, I would say if we would like to start some kind of a conversation or a working group where there's a number of people, and there probably are, there's also the question of money and of cost and of value, and if that's going to be equated to money. So there's a huge question about that in terms of income, in terms of stipends, in terms of even, we've been talking about the universal basic income or universal basic income for artists, and how is that going to be applied to this new approach? So there's a lot of questions that are in relation to that, and if you want to talk more about it, I would like to, and I think we need a lot of voices to talk about ownership, and specifically ownership in an institution, an art institution. Yeah.
Can I? Yeah. Okay. As an art historian, I would of course love to discuss concepts like art, techne, ars, etc. But I think I won't touch this because I want to share two observations and just share it because I see some, let's say, ambiguous, perhaps even problematic aspects in this field that you explore, and that's the reason I want to share it. And we can leave it open. Perhaps you say, no, well, let's discuss this elsewhere. But one thing is, what you presented reminded me of some discussions that must have taken place in this city 45 years ago. It is as if you had now developed a theory of art that the Green Party, founded in 1980, did not develop at that time. Although they were comprehensive enough to revolutionize society in general, etc., etc. But one of the founders was Joseph Beuys, typical male figure, of course, distancing himself from Marcel Duchamp explicitly. Everybody's an artist. So just imagine that. It was part of the DNA of that party, a biological argumentation in a Green Party that somehow included art as a general thing and also excluded it somehow because the Green Party is not a typically pro-art party in the terms of the academy, etc. That's one thing. So in a way, it's like a belated, like an afterword to that, and perhaps there's something that was due. And then the second thing that I found so fascinating that really I thought this is now getting intriguing. 45 years or so after Immanuel Kant's aesthetics, Wilhelm von Humboldt developed a new idea of the cultus based on Greek philosophy. And cultus is what the colleague said, cult, culture, agriculture, is what makes the distinction between the art world of culture, that is high culture, and the, let's say, the general field of practice, what you learn in school. It's about schooling, training, etc. So it's not about the arts as objects, but about the arts of doing this and that, like drawing. And that's why the school is called gymnasium, because, and like in English, the gym is a place for fitness, for body. It's also, as we know, a school. That's typically like Hellenistic, adopted from the Greek. And so this term of the cultus, that's why school ministries in Germany are Kultusministerien. The term itself comes from agriculture. And it is both good, in a way, very original, very German, and it's also very problematic because it's very biological. And that's what I want just to leave open, because I haven't thought this through.
I would just like to say thank you for that. A lot to think about there. Very thought-provoking comments. I'll leave it like that as well, but thank you. Very nice.
I wanted to say, I think products themselves have no worth at all if you have not usership, because users are so important, because they are changing everything into something. If you have a brick or something and you don't have architecture, you don't build any houses and nothing. And I think the usership, what you talked about in the beginning, so everything is transformed. If it's in nature, agriculture, if you see something and people don't have the idea to use it, to do something with these things, to transform them, to help the people in the world. And I think we don't estimate probably enough what the usership means, because it will help to change the world, to make things useful for us. And this is a big art to do that, I think, and very, very important.
Well, thank you for saying that, because, and also your question about ownership, the signal advantage of usership over ownership is that ownership is a fiction. It's a legally supported, very powerful fiction, but it only exists because we're prepared there is a community that is prepared more or less to go along with the fiction. But if everyone was to say the emperor has no clothes on, there is no such thing as ownership. It is not possible for finite beings to enjoy exclusive rights over things unless there is force which is applied to exclude others. That fiction has disastrous consequences. Usership, on the other hand, is not a fiction. People, other forms of life, by virtue of the use which they make, do transform things, and they produce value in doing so. And they always have, but it has become clear through this technological revolution, and perhaps that's true as well with respect to your first question about, we kind of did a sort of an appendix on a Green Party. I mean, it's a very, I feel very honored to think that we might have done something so ambitious without knowing it. But I don't think that it would have been possible 45 years ago to conceptualize in this way usership. It's one of the most under-conceptualized terms in the history of philosophy. There is a history of the concept of use in philosophy, but it's very under-conceptualized. And I think that it's only in the past few years that there's been a kind of sustained, and even so, minority, a sustained interest in this notion of use. And I attribute that to the fact that the sort of a technological coming to the fore has drawn attention to something which can no longer be neglected. In other words, that users are not consumers, nor are they producers, but something else and infinitely more interesting.
Thank you. I have a question that's very practical, and you may not be able to answer it because you just started. I started working here, but before I was in a theater, and I was mentioning, you said spectatorship and eventhood are something you would like to hospice out. And this is something really interesting, because in theater, it's all about spectatorship. The architecture is built around spectatorship, and also it's all about events. A theater is built around events. And we have noticed that the rehearsal time, which is akin to the production time in art, is a very closed process. Once we open it up and we do it regularly, it becomes a performance. You cannot rehearse with people there, you perform rehearsing. And it changes the art, it changes the theater, it makes things obsolete. The author would be obsolete, the text would be obsolete, the buildings would be obsolete. So my question is, how are you approaching this in a very practical way? If you make something visible, that will change the thing you're making visible and will change it in a way that it becomes something else entirely.
That's a great question. I'm not sure that theater is inherently, though, geared towards spectatorship. There is a certain theater historical development that makes, and definitely, which is embodied in the physical architecture of many theaters. But not all theater takes place in that architecture, and not all of it adheres to the conceptual architecture, which is premised on spectatorship. Theater is so much more than spectatorship, I would say. And we're making a proposition. The proposition is that we're going to hospice out some things which we feel are occluding other potentialities. So purposeless purpose, for example, actually does ascribe a certain function to art. It's not that art has no function, but its function is to have no function. Its function is to have an aesthetic function, which this delectation and that art sort of goes on infinitely in this aesthetic pleasure. But we're saying, yeah, but what about the other functions that have long been associated with art? We want to reactivate those. And in order to do that, we need to deactivate. You can't have both. You need to deactivate certain things in order for other ones to emerge. Not in theater, but in art, to reactivate the decorative function, which has become completely taboo. The aesthetic function has completely repressed it. In order to reactivate that, which is a perfectly legitimate function, or the religious function, the spiritual function, or the usological functions, the ones that we're particularly interested in, require this deactivation. But of course, that's not across the board. We're proposing an experiment. Other people will continue, I suppose, within the realm of disinterested spectatorship, and they will assume the contradictions that perhaps go with that, and things will evolve in that way. And I think it's the same thing for theater. I'm familiar with so much theater that's based on really a different kind of paradigm, using all of those fabulous tools which theater has developed since the advent of representation. So thousands of years worth of competence. It should not be said that it must all be expended in that architecture of spectatorship. I think you'd be selling theater.
Oh, I just had one thing to add. I was wondering, would it be interesting for you to think about the possibility of applying some of these ideas to the theater, or is that something that actually would be, just not interesting or not fun for you? Because if it is interesting, then it could be an experiment. Like, we're doing an experiment, and it's not, like we just said, not across the board, but it could be a moment of reflection of what are the components of the theatrical experience, or if you do call it spectatorship, or what are those elements that are really working and you want to hold on to and you want to keep, and then are there, because that's what our reflective process is right now, is looking at what are the components that are fun, that are exciting, that are interesting, that we want to hold on to and that we want to move forward and that we actually want to help grow, we want to nurture, and what are the components that are not functioning, at least in our experience or in our conversations and in the conversations that people were talking with, and right now we're talking together. And so what are those? Is it specific to the exhibition space, the gallery space, the museum space in terms of the creative space, or could some of these ideas or some of these experiments be applied to other creative activities? And that we haven't gone into yet, but it's a wonderful beginning of a conversation.
I mean, it is immensely interesting, but then there's an auditorium that needs to be filled that has 500 seats in it, and it needs to be filled every night.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'll shut us down. So that is, I think, also the kind of rift that you're proposing. You have this wonderful space that you're filling with new ideas, but then there's also kind of forces from outside.
Of course. And I think that's also related to the question of ownership and also of, you know, the art market and the sales and keeping the lights on and the people who have salaries. And yeah, it's a big question. And we are attempting in our small way, as we started planting radishes, it's like, okay, so we're just going to start with these 1,800 seeds, and we're going to see what grows, and we're going to see what dies, and we're going to see where we can go next with these ideas. Yeah.
Just one keyword, entertainment. I missed that in the discussion now. You skipped it, you avoided it on purpose, or what's your attitude to that?
Well, we're not involved in that industry.
Isn't it part of spectatorship and the event booth? What do you say?
And I think you can't be uninvolved.
I would say, are you entertained by art? I think it is a...
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. And so what is the question exactly about the word entertainment?
I missed the term.
Like, where's the fun part?
Is it where's the fun part, or is it a question about the word entertainment? I'm sorry, I didn't quite get it. How come we don't talk about it?
Yes.
We don't talk about fun?
No, entertainment. Entertainment. I just wanted to provoke.
Okay.
But it's I mean, in a way, it's a similar challenge here as ZKM. That ZKM's a strange animal. That it's not a museum, it's not a gallery, it kind of falls between many things. But nonetheless, it's inherited an expectation that it provides entertaining exhibitions, in effect. Okay. Exhibitions that put on a show. But there's also, you know, a huge part of ZKM which is about production and research and, in a way, doing all the things you're describing, the dark matter of the institution. And we often find, actually, that when people visit, they're kind of just entertained, sometimes more entertained, by seeing the things behind the scenes, of seeing the tinkering, of seeing the software engineering, of seeing the people experimenting, people in a real active usership. So it's a tricky balancing act because there's this expectation of what entertainment is and what it could be. And this idea of entertainment as something being delivered to us sat in a chair, so to speak, is so ingrained in our current popular culture, it's very hard for people to see outside of that. So when we talk about, for example, you say, how do you use art? People go, use? I'm not sure I use art, but of course, you know, people do. So it's about changing. There's a big job to do in education, in a societal sense, about rethinking what art actually is and taking a longer view, actually, which is also it's the year of Kant, is it not?
Kant will be 300 on the 24th of April. This is International Kant Year.
On the question of the entertainment, I think the notion of use that you put forward, I mean, it sounds so practical, like people use something and then they leave it because the use is done. But I think like all research and every experience points to the fact that use is connected with relation and with mending and with taking care of things and producing new attachment to institutions, to practices, to other people and whatever. And so that maybe is not entertainment in that sense, like taking part in an event and consuming it, but then of course it's fun. Of course it can produce fun and it can produce some sort of a deep relation to a place. But of course, I mean, that leaves consequences as well. So that relation, that's another part that has to be negotiated. I would suspect at some point that when people get attached and they invest themselves in that kind of use, then of course they want to stay part and take part in things and stay there. So that's another question. But I think, well, to my notion, the entertainment is a notion. Well, it doesn't need to take place because it's replaced by something. By something different.
Thank you.
when we speak about users, we have another word which is attached to it, and it's lurkers. And this word is funnily attached for me with the Künstlerhaus, the very institution you are at now, because I've been there 15 years ago for a brief stint in between 2 other jobs. And the Künstlerhaus had a lot of people I would call lurkers, people who wanted to be around. These were different people. It were students. It were a lot of academic women around 50, 55, like I am now, which impressed me very much in that times. And these were people who had, in a way, nowhere else to go. They were part of the atmosphere, and they needed reasons to be there, but they were also a great enrichment of that atmosphere. So I thought about if we should take the term of a lurker, which we have in the internet, but also in institutions like theaters or like the Künstlerhaus, and think about what do we do with lurkers? Who are these lurkers who grow the atmosphere?
Would you consider lurkers as a separate entity from users or just a different type? Because I would think if there are people that are participating in the space that are contributing, even if they're quiet and they're watching and maybe not putting on a show or maybe not making something tangible, but their presence is, like you just said, contributing to the atmosphere, that is a type of use. But I think your question is possibly, how can these people be invited to be more involved or take more, have more say? Is that your question? Or participate in a greater way or in a deeper way?
My question is not fully formed, because I think what makes lurking important is that you need something like an excuse to be there.
Okay.
So that you work with, you have an excuse to be in that place. So it's not really like you use that place, but you use that place to have an excuse. I don't know.
I like it. I like to think about that.
I also would see it as a form of use, of a form of not passive usership, but not fully active usership, a different, substantively different type of usership. One model that sometimes is used in usology to specify these things is the terms used in torrent sharing. So there's a user is downloading from a seeder, but as the downloader is downloading, they become another category, which is called a leecher. And you cannot download without yourself being downloaded from. It goes with that. It's kind of the beauty of the torrent share system, is that if you want to download, then people can download what you've already downloaded during that download time. And that category of usership is called leechers. And leecher it's a kind of a derogatory term, but in this case, it's kind of the beauty of the system. And I think the beauty of the system is that within that usership, which is highly differentiated, and so we see that at the Künstlerhaus, but we want to think of it usership as one, but variegated within itself. Do you know at the Künstlerhaus, we learned recently there are 600 members who are paid up. So each year they pay their dues because, and you might say many of them must be lurkers because we don't see them. They don't come to the meetings. They don't write incensed emails to the new artistic directors. They're not part of that active usership that do that sort of thing. In
my time, they came to the office. Yeah. And they stayed there for around 5 minutes and had an excuse just to stay there for these 5 minutes and to have a talk.
I think also this probably is not specific to the Künstlerhaus, but I think art and theater and music and the cultural sectors, there is an energy and there is something quite exciting, and it is related to being near. And some people are not into actually making something, or they want to make something, but they don't know how to make something in that field. And so there is this possibly various groups that it's a part of this way of doing what we do, is having these groups that are nearby or that want to be close but don't actually want to get maybe their hands dirty in the ceramics workshop, but still like talking about these ideas, or like stopping by the office for 5 minutes and connecting and being in this relationship that we are in. So I think that probably relates to a larger question about how we do the creative things that we do in these groups. Yeah, thanks.
Speaking of lurkers, I think we're close to time, but people are welcome to lurk around afterwards and maybe ask a few more questions.
One short question. Maybe I missed your preposition of the German word of usership.
Well, that would be a longer conversation because the mechanics of the English word is that it comes from us, from Latin, which is front-loaded on a German suffix, which is Schaft. So it's like it's using the bastardized origins of the English language by putting the Saxon and the Latin together, which makes it impossible to translate into other languages. Because in French, for instance, it means both usager and usage. In Spanish, both usuario and uso. It would literally mean in Spanish usuaridad, but this word is a bit of a stretch. So in German, when Marx talked about use, he talked about Gebrauch. And although in a way what we say about usership is kind of anti-Marxist, it comes from a Marxist tradition in a certain way. But I noticed that technical people tend to translate it much more directly in German as Nutzerschaft, and which would be closer to my ear in French to utilisateur and not usager, or someone who utilizes something rather than a user. So I'm still training my German ear. I don't have an answer to that question, but it's something that I think about a lot.
Maybe you find a Swabian expression.
Well, that would be very, very sort of usership congenial, wouldn't it? I mean, because, in proposing this vocabulary, it's not about proposing some sort of like out with the old and in with the new, but it's about listening carefully to words which are being used but which don't enjoy the dignity, the epistemological dignity of terms like spectatorship, and trying to tease them out of the shadows into the conversation.
That's a nice note to end on the definition, or the German translation. Thank you both very, very much. It's been really helpful, I think, to have this perspective here at ZKM, where we're also rethinking our structures and what we hospicize. And I will just see if you have any final words.
Yeah, thank you also from my side very much. I think radical propositions are always good to think about and to experience. And it's also good to hear them here in this place. And yeah, I want to thank everybody for questions and für die Aufmerksamkeit und so weiter. Und ich möchte Sie einladen, wiederzukommen. Wir haben den nächsten Teil dieser Serie, wird stattfinden am 16. März. Wir haben Boris Buden eingeladen. Er ist Philosoph, Linguist, auch Vertretungsprofessor gerade an der HfG in der Medienphilosophie und wird uns mitnehmen und uns einladen, quasi über Übersetzung nachzudenken. Und Übersetzung meint nicht nur Übersetzung zwischen Sprachen, sondern auch Übersetzung zwischen verschiedenen Medien. Also vielen Dank, kommen Sie wieder. Tschüss.